Well, let's begin our lecture over the Constitution. I'm going to do my best to try to be succinct and kind of summarize, hopefully without sacrificing any quality or anything, on the historical context that surrounds the development of the Constitution and the reasons that it came into being. But clearly, I want to put more emphasis on the actual document itself because it will be the foundation for the remainder of the course. I mean, it is really the basis of the federal government by definition, and so we're going to want to be familiar with the document itself at least as much as the historical context under which it was developed. So bear with me as we try to move through and hit some of the high points for the context, because it is important to understand why it came about. Don't misunderstand. But we're certainly going to want to have a little more time spent on some of the passages and the actual text within the document itself as we move along throughout the next 14 weeks of the course. So let's just begin, and you'll see what I mean as we get moving. Chapter 2 is, of course, on the document. It came into being after this period of benign neglect, and I say it came into being after this period of benign neglect. There actually, maybe a better way to phrase it would be that there was a period of benign neglect in which the colonies, the English colonies, were left alone by the crown. Technology probably had something to do with that. Of course, there was no internet. There were no methods of communication that could cross the ocean very quickly. In fact, messages had to be brought back and forth by very slow means on ships, written down. The ships themselves were slow. Things were weather dependent. When I say we didn't have the internet, we didn't even yet have the steam engine either. There was no telegraph, nothing that would help accelerate communication between the 13 colonies and England. There weren't always 13 colonies. This period of benign neglect started way back when Jamestown and Plymouth and a lot of the other colonies began to be set up in the early part of the 17th century, which is the 1600s. But we had spent all that time. If you start looking at the time frame between about 1615, when the first permanent English colonies were established, all the way to 1776, when we issued the Declaration of Independence from the Second Continental Congress, American colonists had been left largely to themselves. They had been able to engage in self-governance. We had talked about the examples of direct democracy in American political history, being some of those New England towns. They were able to exercise that in large part because they were left to their own devices, and those towns were small enough to where they could have town meetings where things were voted on by the people who lived there, the residents. Usually, we don't need to go into this too deeply, but usually men or property owning males, but nonetheless still kind of an example of direct democracy in American political history that was allowed to take place partly because of this period of benign neglect that lasted for a century and a half roughly between the founding of the English colonies and the Declaration of Independence, or really more specifically, as we'll talk about in a moment, around the middle of the 1760s. That's when things started to get a little more tense between the colonies, and this period of benign neglect actually came to an end. But while we were over here operating quasi-independently as it was in a functional sense, we ended up developing our own upper class. And you had people like these well-known names and figures: Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, all participating in society as members of the, I guess the American version of the upper class. Hamilton was a little bit of a different story. He wasn't born into it in the hereditary sense, like perhaps you could say George Washington had at least some claim to have done. We, again, don't have time to get into all of those things, but Hamilton was not born in what would become the United States, and really kind of ascended through the American political ranks just because of his capability and his intellect. But we did have an upper class that did have, and Hamilton is a good example of this, had some meritocracy kinds of elements to it, meaning if you had capability or abilities, you could advance yourself in the American colonies in ways you might not have been able to back in Europe. But let's move on here to this and talk about kind of what this benign neglect, this period of benign neglect kind of had going on for it. There was this economic system known as mercantilism, where the mother country, in our case, for our purposes, is going to be England, or later on the United Kingdom. They benefited greatly from raw materials being produced in the colonies, sent back essentially to England. Manufactured goods would be produced, and then of course the goods would be sent back to the colonies to be resold after they were refined or improved upon, or made a part of a finished good. And the colonies, in many cases, weren't able to trade with themselves or with each other, excuse me. And as this kind of graph actually shows, so you can see how the as we're calling it, the mother country, or for our purposes, England, would benefit greatly by preventing the colonies from developing much more self-sufficient economies. All of these elements here of being left alone and being part of this type of economic system, they would all kind of come into to a head at about the same time in the 1760s because of the French and Indian War. The Europeans called it the 7 Years' War. It was essentially a war between England and France. The French had some Indian allies here in North America, and the war was fought in on such far-flung battlefields that many historians will kind of refer to it facetiously as the actual First World War, because there were battlefields on multiple continents and in oceans all over the globe. But after that war was over, we don't need to really talk about the details of the conflict, but we do need to talk about how it was of great expense to England to actually win that war. And after it was over, you started to see the Parliament and the Crown back in Britain say, hey, we went to great expense to actually defend these colonies, as they should have. I mean, they are British colonies. But they felt that the colonies needed to chip into the debt that was accumulated while that war was going on, and that defense was being provided along the western frontier. There were always the possibility of and there were some battles that dealt with or were involved French forces and their Indian allies, and they wanted to pay off the debt that again that accumulated in winning those battles and protecting the colonies. So this is where the common story about taxes and why the no taxation without representation and everything kind of came into play for the American colonies, and that again that maybe the common story you're told about how they rebelled essentially against paying taxes when they had no representation in Parliament. Of course, the English felt like the colonists, as English subjects, British subjects, were represented in Parliament just inherently by the members that were already there. But given our experiences here, kind of relating back to maybe perhaps even our limited experiences with things like that New England town version of direct democracy or a few other things, we felt we needed to have um, colonists as a member of Parliament before we could truly be subjected to these taxes, no matter whether what they were used for, to defend the colonies or not. Taxation without representation, and it was again that old motto or slogan that we've all heard, kind of related back to trying to pay off the war debt incurred during the French and Indian Wars that happened during this part of the 18th century or the 1700s. Another thing that kind of came out of the French and Indian War was the Proclamation of 1763. And it's not necessarily monetary, or certainly it's not directly monetary, but it was something that further served to exacerbate the tensions between the colonies and Britain. And you can tell on this red line where there was, and I'm pretty sure that's roughly accurate. I always say it's the crest of the Appalachians, but about this red line is where the Crown, the British Crown, said the colonists could no longer settle further west or they couldn't settle further west than that red line. Some people already actually had land that they claimed beyond the Appalachians. Many people coveted the land beyond the Appalachians. Some people felt that they had fought in the French and Indian Wars for some of that land that they helped, I guess, get, as kind of a spoils of war from the French or from certain Indian tribes, just as a result of that war of the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. So they were upset. to say the least, that they suddenly had this what they thought of as an arbitrary limitation for where they could settle. It's something that goes unmentioned a little bit in some history courses, but I wanted to mention it here just to kind of point out that a lot of the grievances that the colonists had didn't always relate directly back to things like taxation. But of course, those were the major reasons. Um, I've mentioned this, tradition of self-government. I had mentioned the mercantile system as being a reason why there could be some tension. Many people did start to see beyond taxation, even some of the financial costs related to how the economic system was set up. Why would we continue to enrich Britain at the expense of America by constantly shipping our raw materials back to them to do something with, rather than developing an economy of our own? A lot of opportunity costs, I think, that it was being recognized that we were incurring, and so things were just really moving in a direction that had the colonists ready to, well, they were upset. I don't want to say ready to rebel, and we'll get into that in a moment. Because it's not a history course, we'll move through this rather quickly. But this is the period in which you had things like the Boston Tea Party and the Boston Massacre. I'm saying these things out of order, but this is when a lot of those events that you've been previously taught about in a history course took place. But we need to jump all the way up here to 1774 with the First Continental Congress. You'd heard me mention a moment ago that it was the Second Continental Congress that actually issued the Declaration of Independence in 1776. This First Continental Congress took place in 1774. The grievances weren't stacked high enough for all colonies to participate. Georgia ended up not sending any delegates to the First Continental Congress, despite the fact that the focus of it was simply to tell England or tell the British Crown what we were upset about, and see if there couldn't be some kind of negotiated compromise. There was still this strong sense of loyalty. The colonists still thought of themselves as English subjects to a large degree at this point, and even into the Revolution, many still did. But the sentiment for rebellion was not quite there yet. It took another couple of years and some early battles in the Revolutionary War to really get that started. But this First Continental Congress took place in 1774 and did not have a Declaration of Independence or any equivalent really seriously even considered or proposed. But you get into 1775 a year later, and you do ultimately end up getting there. Now, please be aware that it wasn't until the middle of 1776 before the Continental Congress actually drafted and issued the Declaration of Independence. But we did get there. We established a colonial army. We made I keep saying we, but the soon-to-be framers and founders of the country you did things like making Washington the general-in-chief of the war effort, and we'd had some skirmishes and battles and things take place at Lexington and Concord, and even some lesser-known kinds of conflicts in New Hampshire even before that finally led to an open conflict and the need to seriously consider a break from England. But it took from 1775 into 1776 to actually get that declaration issued, and a unanimous or very close to unanimous vote in the Second Continental Congress to take place to establish that independence, or at least declare it. I'm going to move quickly through these slides because some of what we're going to talk about here were already discussed in Chapter 1. But we talked about John Locke and some of his ideas on state of nature and why laws and government were in existence in the first place. But the reason that I mention them is because you end up having Thomas Jefferson use some language straight out of some of John Locke's works to develop the Declaration of Independence. The wording, we hold these truths to be or I'm sorry, I need to back up. The wording of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness actually comes from some of John Locke's, I think, second treatise on government, where he says that there is a need for government to try to protect life, liberty, and property. Jefferson cribbed off that a little bit and might have been, guilty of plagiarism if he didn't adequately explain where what he was referring to. But you can see the similarities between life, liberty, and property of John Locke, and then life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that Jefferson ended up using. There's these concepts too that might not have been quite so closely cut and pasted from John Locke, but nonetheless, consent of the governed was a concept that found its way into the Declaration of Independence, and was certainly something that John Locke had espoused in talking about social contracts and things like that. And here is the phraseology: life, liberty, and property that I was talking about a moment ago. And you'll even see this right to revolution being put forward in the Declaration if you were to read its text. At one point, Jefferson says that governments are instituted to protect the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And any time a government becomes destructive of those ends, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it. And he's again kind of borrowing from John Locke in in that conceptual framework, and even in some of the phrasing. But John Locke was an important influence on the thinking of certainly Thomas Jefferson and probably other colonists that were considering whether or not to break from England and how to do it. I forgot that I actually had the text of this of the Declaration in this slideshow, but you can see here the slight difference. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And again, you can jump down here to the governments deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. Both are concepts that we just talked about, and had talked about in chapter 1 a little bit in our reading, I guess I should say, rather than talked about, since it's an online course. But John Locke kind of putting forward. Now, ultimately, we end up with something that is drawn up, and it is known as the Articles of Confederation, and some people will, quite often refer to it as our first Constitution, and that's because it was the governing document of the 13 colonies, early in the history, or during the Revolutionary War, and a short period thereafter, until we developed the Constitution in 1787. Note this word Confederation. It's going to come into play in the next chapter when we talk about federalism. There's another concept that's related to it, of course, confederalism, and there's some unitary government concepts that we will talk about. But take note of this word, confederation. We'll refer back to the articles just a little bit in chapter 3, just for context's sake and everything else when we get there. But under the Articles of Confederation, states retained most of their power. We only had a unicameral legislature. This is another concept that we'll talk about later in this chapter, where we talk about the development of a bicameral national legislature for the House and the Senate, rather than simply having a single chamber for the national legislature. But under the Articles, there was only one chamber for the national legislature. Each state only has one vote in the national legislature, and note that this could be seen as, some people saw it as an attractive feature back in the days of the operation of the Articles, but many people also saw it as a weakness. It just kind of depended on your perspective, and we need to talk about some of those weaknesses of the Articles, now. It was difficult to alter the Articles or get anything passed under the Articles just because of some of the rules within it, the one state, one vote situation, but Congress itself, or that national legislature, actually lacked power to do things as simple as make treaties and conduct foreign relations. States could even break treaties that were signed. Their taxation was something the national government could not do. It couldn't draft soldiers. It couldn't regulate commerce between what would become, I guess, the United States as we think of it, and other countries, or even in between the states. There were a large number of things that, of weaknesses, I guess I should say, under the Articles of Confederation that didn't allow for unified action amongst the colonies, or I guess if you even wanted to say this, the United States before the Constitution was passed. Some colonies were still issuing their own currencies or using the British pound or the Spanish dollar. They were putting tariffs against each other. Lots of discombobulation, I guess, to use kind of an informal word, but they weren't all pulling in the same direction. And I think some people recognized that there was really no way for the former colonies, now states, to truly compete with the superpowers of the day in England and France and Spain, and really even probably the Dutch, economically, militarily, or anything, so long as they continued to have this type of disunity, and both reflected by and caused by these weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation. Um, I've kind of talked about those complaints. I'm sorry, those weaknesses already, and so I'm just going to jump ahead here to some of these Federalist personalities like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. We'll talk about Madison as being the father of the Constitution. He later became president under the Constitution. He was a believer in a stronger central government, but he kind of paled in comparison probably to someone like Alexander Hamilton, who at various points in time had actually proposed, maybe even in just a whisper, but had talked about the restoration of a monarchy in the United States. Of course, the obvious person to do that would, to take the new American throne, had there ever been one, would have been George Washington. And he wasn't real thrilled about that idea, and that was a big reason why it might not have ever come into being. But Alexander Hamilton definitely was a big fan and proponent of centralized authority and wanted the Articles to go away. Um, but pretty soon you had some people actually step up. We will later refer to them as Jeffersonian Republicans or even Democratic Republicans. But they stepped forward to say, wait a second, we kind of like having the states with some independence and sovereignty of their own that is in no way connected to, and certainly not in any way dependent on a central government for that power, that authority, or that sovereignty. They became known as anti-federalists after the declaration. I'm sorry, after the Constitution was actually written. They opposed its going into effect, or what we'll refer to as its ratification, because they felt that new Constitution gave the central government too much authority, and it was going to be subject to abuse from that national government. And to this day, I think that there's a lot in the United States or the American kind of political DNA to have almost a two-party system based upon us having anti-federalists who didn't like the new Constitution and federalists, straightforward, that did want the Constitution to go into effect. And I think ever since then, we've almost kind of just had this unspoken like understanding or desire to have everything be, a yes or a no, or anti-federalist and federalist, or Democrat and Republican. I think that goes all the way back. You can follow that thread all the way back to the beginning of the country to just have almost a kind of bilateral type of politics. But that's for a discussion later. Let's jump ahead here and start pointing out, though, some things that occurred that actually strengthened the Federalists' hands. There were obvious weaknesses and some inefficiencies and things, but these events like Shays' Rebellion ended up really kind of putting an exclamation mark behind what the Federalists were saying and the points they were trying to make. So, in 1786 and into early 1787, you had Daniel Shays end up kind of getting together this group of farmers who were in debt, and they also happened to be Revolutionary War veterans, so they were pretty decent at the at rebelling against things. But they definitely kind of tried to make their point through this rebellion against the high interest rates they were being charged on the debts that they owed to some of these the banker class or the upper class or whatever you want to say. Particularly, I guess, in eastern Massachusetts is where the rebellion took place. But ultimately, the rebellion was put down, but there was a lot of fear as to whether or not there would be a strong enough authority to be able to actually do so. And people were starting to wonder if we were kind of bringing ideas back from revolutionary France into the United States. I mean, it was almost kind of like this feedback loop in that the United States had its revolution, and there were many people then and now that feel like it helped, was an impetus for France to begin its revolution. for many different reasons that we won't go into here, but they felt they were like closely related, and then there was this fear again that that connection actually was bringing ideas back into the U.S. and causing maybe some of these more violent types of manifestations of your discontent to show up like they were doing in France. So now you've got some people saying, okay, see, we tried to tell you, that there were going to be some weaknesses, that we would need a central authority with a little bit more power to be able to put down things like Shays' Rebellion, um, and they were able to point to those instances to try to be able to get support for a new constitution, and in particular they were aiming at the property owning class and some others that for economic reasons to say, hey, we really need to bring some unity to our efforts in governance here in the United States. We can't have 13 different foreign policies, and we can't have European countries sending 13 different or 14 different diplomats over here to talk to all these different governments. Let's try to bring this under one umbrella a little bit more. And so they ended up calling this constitutional convention to amend the Articles of Confederation. There had already been a couple of attempts to hold a constitutional convention or to amend the Articles of Confederation, but those meetings almost never had enough political support to truly begin that process. But in Philadelphia of 1787, you had some heavy hitters like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and a few others lend their name and reputation to the proceedings, and they were able to gather enough people, enough delegates in Philadelphia in that summer of 1787 to begin the work of creating a new constitution. But ultimately, you had some some anti-federalist people with leanings towards maybe state sovereignty and what we today would call states' rights. Get pretty upset at this initial decision to actually not just amend the Articles of Confederation, but to toss them completely out. It became clear very quickly that the convention would actually start to draft a new form of government and wouldn't actually be doing the work of amending the articles. So some people just left. These leading Republicans, as the slide says, either didn't participate because they already could see what was coming, or chose to leave once they saw what was happening. And so you had Federalists dominate the proceedings, and you even had a high-profile figure like Jefferson, who was already out of the country, serving as ambassador to France. That could have been somewhat offset by John Adams being serving as the ambassador to England at this time. It's sometimes overlooked that two prominent figures like Jefferson and Adams weren't actually a part of drawing up the new Constitution. Jefferson was going to be kind of a prominent, what we'd call an anti-federalist, and John Adams would be a prominent federalist. Both ended up being presidents a little later. But the Federalists ended up dominating the proceedings, and they ended up saying, you know what, we're just going to throw the articles out, try to come up with something completely new. And that completely new thing, because of a lack of these Jeffersonian Republicans, or these anti-federalists as they would come to be called, meant that Federalist ideas carried the day. They had to resolve a couple of issues, though. They did want to have a popular government, one that had the consent of the governed and yet protected against the tyranny of the majority. That's another one of those things from Chapter 1 that you probably read about, trying to protect against political whim, stripping people of their rights based upon just pure majoritarianism, saying we were able to get 50% plus one person to agree on something. Doesn't mean that it automatically ought to go into effect. Part of the reason the Constitution exists is to provide those types of barriers against government action, whether it's majority supported or not, when it comes to infringing on people's rights. And so to take that kind of a step further, they wanted to protect against just a tyranny of the majority. And so again, we'll get into it in the next few slides and talk about how they created a mixed form of government and a republic rather than exercising a direct democracy. Logistically, that would have been, I think, difficult anyway, but certainly at the federal level it would have been. But they created this mixed government that we'll talk about in a moment. And then, of course, how do you centralize power in one national government without, creating a tyranny of the, one or the few? Kind of a federalism question in some ways. You don't want to centralize power so much that states lose their autonomy, and that some states, some regions, some smaller groups unrelated to those political units, you might end up having their rights trampled upon. And in the way they did that was they tried to create separate functions of the government and different branches within it to create a system of checks and balances. So it's also an internal function of that government as well. It's not just entirely a federalism question. In fact, we'll probably talk about it in terms of the checks and balances and the different branches more than a federalism question until we get to the next chapter. All right, this first issue. How do you prevent a tyranny of the majority? Well, first and foremost, you just don't practice a direct democracy. You can see Benjamin Franklin's rather is it pithy? Is that the word I'm looking for? Quote about democracy being two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. You want to avoid a real life situation that occurs where a weaker party, in this case, in Franklin's example, the lamb, being outvoted by two stronger parties, in this case, a couple of wolves. Here's one thing that I want to point out that was very different in the early days as to how the Constitution was set up. We'd have to wait all the way until the early part of the 20th century to actually change this fact, that the senators were chosen by state legislators or legislatures. The popular selection or election of senators didn't take place until after the ratification of the 17th Amendment during kind of the progressive era at the early part of the 20th century. So for quite a while, you had state legislatures, and I guess therefore legislators, the individuals were contributing to the decision about who would be in this kind of aristocratic type Senate. I actually kind of prefer kind of more of a to refer to it as the maybe elite type of body. I sometimes argue with the slides that say we've got a monarchy and an aristocracy and everything else. A democratic house is a little easier to accept, but I did just want to stop to point out more than anything that originally senators were actually selected by state legislators. The only direct election was to the House of Representatives by the people. That was the only directly elected officials by the people were the House members. The president, of course, was chosen by the Electoral College, and we're still kind of coming to grips with that today. Is it still a good thing? Is it has it outlived its usefulness? We'll talk about that a little bit later. But this is one that often gets overlooked: is this legislature's picking these senators. I'm going to skip reading these walls of text again to try to summarize a little bit and make sure that you're not having to sit here for 3 hours at a stretch on this entire lecture. But there are just very quickly some things in the Federalist Papers. I'll define the historical importance of those a little bit later, but they were written by people like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, and they outlined reasons for ratifying the Constitution. And they had some quotes in there that would give a window into their thinking about why they set up mixed forms of government in 3 different branches and how they wanted to settle the relationship between the states and the federal government. And again, we'll go into a little bit more detail on that a little later. But if I've talked enough for you to read that whole thing, great. Or you can pause the video and read it. But the Federalist Papers are filled with a lot of quotes like that. Here's one of those quotes, actually, is ambition must be made to counteract ambition. And I make the mistake sometimes of using that phrase out of the context that Madison exactly meant it. He was talking in terms of separating the functions of government to make sure that no one branch got too powerful, so that you didn't have a presidency or an executive branch figure. I guess it would be the president. There's really only a president and a vice president in the executive branch, constitutionally speaking. But making sure that they didn't go off too far, running too fast, do anything that would infringe upon the rights and liberties of the American people. And but that person could also serve in the role of making sure that you didn't have kind of a collective tyranny in the form of the United States Congress. There was an old movie. It's strange to refer to it as an old movie now, but called The Patriot. And I think that they used there was a quote by the main character who said, something about, in terms of whether the colonies needed to rebel against Great Britain. Somebody said, be very careful about trading one tyrant in King George, essentially 1,000 miles away for 1,000 tyrants 1 mile away. They went on to kind of explain, to say, an elected legislature can trample on a man's rights as easily as a king can. And I think that the founders and framers were aware of this, and it's why they ended up kind of leaning on this concept that Madison outlined as ambition counteracting ambition, knowing that each of the forms of government would counteract one another. Government of the one in the presidency, government of the few, perhaps in terms of I guess you could even say that's the judicial branch in some ways, and of course government by the many in the legislative branch. You'll often hear that series of checks and balances referred to as the Madisonian model, and this or the separation of powers. They kind of all overlap and all kind of lead to the same thing. You've got a legislature that's going to make laws, and of course we'll talk about how it's a two-chambered legislature in a moment. You've got an executive that enforces those laws that the legislature wrote, and then of course you've got the judiciary that interprets those laws that the executive is enforcing after the legislature passes them. We're going to have to talk about the power of judicial review in a little while as well. It's not found in the Constitution explicitly, but certainly this Madisonian model would probably not function very well if the judiciary didn't have the power of judicial review to kind of evaluate the actions of the legislature and the executive, check them against the Constitution to make sure that they were appropriate under its passages. Again, that's something that will come up a little bit later, but this is really in some ways just a very kind of technical and political type of rock paper scissors that game that they basically make be played every time there's an action taken by any of these three branches, because they all have a check or a balance against one another. Here's a chart that somewhat kind of outlines that. I'll leave it here for just a moment and try to make a few brief comments so that you can also read through it. You can pause the video, of course, if you want to look at this in more detail. But this is a very simplistic rendering of some of the checks and balances that each branch has against another. Of course, you've got your executive, you've got your legislative, you've got your judicial branches, and you see these arrows kind of pointing out what each of them may do to one another. The judicial branch, of course, can rule some presidential action unconstitutional. At the same time, that doesn't always mean that they're unchecked by the executive, because the executive branch, as we'll talk about later, plays a big part in who becomes a part of the judicial branch. The judicial branch can also declare laws passed by the legislative branch or the Congress as unconstitutional, but the Senate plays a role in approving who the president says goes on the judicial branch. It establishes the structure of the court system, and you could run through several scenarios in other ways in which you could take the perspective of the executive branch, for instance, and say that it appoints these people to the judicial branch, but only with the advice and consent of the Senate. And there's always this multi-layered approach to keep any one branch from being able to overpower the others, leverage one of the others into an argument against the third. Again, this is just a very simplistic rendering of that, and there are a lot of other checks and balances that exist in this Madisonian model or in this system. Again, I'm going to try to avoid these walls of text to try to keep the lecture somewhat digestible and short. But here's another reference to a Federalist paper. You can tell we're getting up to number 51. Earlier, I think we were looking at number 10. There were dozens of these essays that were written by Madison and Jay and Hamilton, and we'll again probably end up talking about them a little bit more later. But here is another quote that you may kind of want to look into a little bit if you're interested in some of those concepts that we just talked about and that we're going to talk about here. But let's start talking about how the legislature came into being, the Congress, as we call it today. Under the Articles of Confederation, we had a unicameral legislature, and here's that word again. It's if you need help kind of remembering it, just uni. Remember that's an old prefix meaning one. Think like a unicycle or something. And then, of course, if you have a bicycle with two wheels, it'll be a bicameral legislature, and that's where we ultimately end up. However, that wasn't the original plan, as these debates kept taking place in September of 1787 in Philadelphia. And this is where I'm going to slow down just a bit and make sure that we get a little bit more detail in here and make sure that I make the points really, really clear. In 1787, in Philadelphia, once they had decided to totally throw out the Articles of Confederation, they still needed to figure out what the basic structure of the new government was going to be like. And the assumption was that you would have a unicameral legislature. Today, it almost seems like it's natural to have a bicameral legislature with two chambers. But the Articles operated under a unicameral system. Even today, we still have the state of Nebraska operating a unicameral legislature. It's the only one of the 50 that does it, but it is possible, it's permissible. And early on in the Constitutional Convention, there were many people, many of the delegates, who just kind of went that direction because that's what they had always done. The problem was, how were you going to, how was each state going to be represented in that legislature? The large states, of which Virginia was the largest. We don't think of Virginia as being overwhelmingly large these days, but in this time frame, in this time period, it absolutely was the biggest state. You have to remember that even without this taking place, or even without this, Virginia would have been the largest colony, but West Virginia was also still a part of Virginia at this time. West Virginia would not secede from Virginia until the Civil War, when Virginia seceded from the United States, and they never rejoined. But Virginia, suffice it to say, was a big state. Excuse me. They're states now, and had been for about a decade at this point. And they wanted the states in this unicameral legislature to be represented proportionally. What that means is the more people you have in your state, the more people you're going to have in that legislative body to vote and try to, I guess, engage in debate and conversation. And you can understand Virginia's perspective. Not only was it, I guess, somewhat self-serving, of course, but there is a certain amount of logic to having larger states have more representation. However, you had smaller states like New Jersey. This is kind of a situation that's a little bit reversed from Virginia. Today, we think of New Jersey as being a somewhat, at least a medium-sized state. I mean, it's got a lot of suburbs of New York City and is more populous than where we are here in Oklahoma. So we think of it as being a slightly bigger state. But in this time frame, New Jersey was actually agricultural, relatively small, sparsely populated compared to today. And so it was proposing it was proposing a plan that the smaller states were actually going to really latch onto, and it mimicked what was kind of taking place under the Articles of Confederation, where each state would have a vote, or at least equal representation in the National Congress. Well, this whole, I guess, controversy actually threatened to upend the Constitutional Convention very, very early on. This was something that they were having a difficult time resolving, and a lot of people nearly went home saying, well, if we're just going to totally be steamrolled by these larger states, then we don't want any part of this. And of course, the larger states were like, if we're not going to resolve some of the unfairness and the weaknesses of the articles, then what are we even doing here? And nobody really wanted to budge. But along came what came to be known as the Great Compromise, and sometimes it's called the Connecticut Compromise. And even though the slide doesn't say it, and I don't believe the next slide will either, there was a gentleman named Roger Sherman from Connecticut who proposed a bicameral legislature. And of course, there were some tweaks and some other small changes and compromises to this, but But basically, he said, let's have two chambers. We can call it the Senate and the House, and in the Senate you can have equal representation. Strangely enough, they still didn't go for one state, one vote. They went for each state getting two senators who can, if they want to, vote in different ways. But in the House, you ended up having proportional representation. That's more along the lines of what Virginia wanted, and it was something that the large states, of course, were going to be more accepting of, or were going to advocate for, I suppose I should say. And the New Jersey plan was maybe represented at least somewhat in this equal representation compromise in the Senate. Instead of just having one state, one vote, though, you got two senators per state who could, again, in theory, vote divergently from one another. And the smaller states were more inclined to accept that. Put together, everybody seemed pretty happy. There was a problem with just who you would count in terms of this proportional representation. And again, we'll get into some of that a little bit later. But for now, we had at least moved beyond the bickering between the big states, kind of headed up by kind of represented by Virginia and their plan, and the small states, which again, most of the smaller states tucked in behind New Jersey and their plan. It was resolved through this great compromise from Roger Sherman out of Connecticut, and it kept everything kind of moving along, and we ultimately got to a final document at the end of 1787. There were a lot of compromises in it, not just the separation of powers, not just the bicameral legislature. There were some other things where you had to talk about, states having Republican governments. Note the small r. It's not related, to the modern political party, but you had to have indirect democracies essentially by constitutional mandate. You couldn't have direct democracies under the Constitution. And then, of course, as we'll talk about in Chapter 3, there was a federal system where there was a shared kind of power arrangement between state and local governments. The Anti-Federalists would end up saying that balance was tilted too much in favor of the federal government, and the Federalists were saying, well, that's exactly what we wanted, because otherwise you end up with things like Shays' Rebellion, or an inability for the United States to compete effectively against foreign powers. I do want to make mention before I get into just the actual structure here, the final document. I thought I had a slide on this, but apparently I don't. There was the 3/5 compromise. If we're going to talk about proportional representation, meaning each state and it's the amount of representation it gets in the House of Representatives, if it's going to be determined by population, there was a big question as to whether or not to count the slave population in the South. Of course, the southern states wanted to have it both ways. They wanted slaves to count towards that proportional representation in the House, but they also didn't want the slaves to have the right to vote. I mean, they again wanted it both ways. There was a compromise ultimately that was reached in which we call it the 3/5 compromise, and it would take 5 slaves to equate to 3 free persons in the count towards that proportional representation, which also affected the number of votes that each state got in the Electoral College, and affected how much influence they had on the selection or election of a president and a vice president. So it was kind of a big deal, but and it kept the convention together, and yet at the same time, when you take a step back and look at it, you're essentially saying that the founding document of the country explicitly labeled some people as being only worth 3/5 a value of others, and it's a stain on that original document. There's a lot of debate about whether it had to be done, should have been done, whether there could have been some other compromise reached that we don't have time for here. But when it comes to the Congress that is you described in Article 1, that was another large hurdle, high hurdle that they had to clear, and they did it in a way that, looking back, is embarrassing. But ultimately, we did end up with the Constitution, and it was structured this way. Article 1, and you'll note these, you'll see this abbreviation form a lot here. By the way, and Roman numerals are the way that most people seem to refer to parts of the Constitution known as articles when they're referring to those subset or those parts. There are also sections and clauses that we'll talk about later, but for now, just the big groupings. They're almost like chapters, but we call them articles. There's 7 of them. Article 1 is where Congress comes from, and it's the dominant branch in the framers' eyes at the time, and we're still having that debate today, as is being kind of it's being brought to the forefront by this impeachment battle and some of the arguments being made in it currently. But Congress makes the laws, and that bicameral legislature makes the laws, and it's a fairly complex process even within the Congress that we will talk about in the chapter over that branch of the government. Article 2 is the executive branch. Of course, it enforces the laws and carries out the policies passed by the Congress. And then Article 3 is the judiciary. And as we mentioned earlier, it interprets the laws and has the power of judicial review, even if it isn't explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. We'll talk about how that comes about a little bit later, but that's one, it's indispensable to its ability to interpret the laws, or at least interpret them in a way that has any functional value. And then Article 4, this is going to be kind of related to, it's talking about the relations between the states, but it's going to be connected to our discussion on federalism later to some degree. But there had to be some type of resolution about how the states were going to interact with each other and what level of cooperation was going to be expected between them, and they tried to outline that here in Article 4. Article 5, we've got a lot of information to go through a little bit later about how to amend the Constitution. And we'll, again, jump into this in greater detail later. Article 6, another federalism-related article that talks about how the Constitution and is the supreme law of the land, and some of the details for it will be mentioned in Chapter 3 in the next set of lectures. And then Article 7, how to ratify the Constitution. These are the 7 articles, but this 7th one became almost I don't want to say inert. I mean, I guess it basically did after the Constitution was ratified. And just to clarify, this word ratify means to put into effect. It means that through some method there was approval given to the Constitution. But we have to talk about that method now, and kind of the battle that took place, not a literal one, but a figurative one, the debate, the conversation that took place over the ratification of the Constitution. Because even though now we have all of the text of this document, and eventually, it's 27 amendments, we need to talk about how ultimately approval was granted by the states, how many it took, and some of the conversations that took place in the debate, because they were illustrative. I mean, meaning they were instructive. As we talk about the ratification battle for the Constitution, you'll get some insight into the thinking of the framers, and we'll also talk about a few famous amendments that play a big part in this course and in American society moving forward. You had your anti-ratification forces. You had people like Thomas Jefferson, and as soon as he returned from France, you had Patrick Henry. He's well known for his "Give me liberty" or "Give me death" quote from the Second Continental Congress. Sam Adams, the cousin of John Adams, was not a real big fan of the Constitution. We have to remember, and by the way, just again to make sure that this is clear, the term Republicans here, this is different than the modern incarnation of the Republican Party, or actually, I guess I should say different than the Republican Party. When we get into the chapter over the political parties, I believe it's chapter 6, we'll confuse things a lot, but and let me go ahead and kind of preempt some of that and get your wheels turning. But this Republicans label is actually the party that this would ultimately become, was the progenitor to the modern Democratic Party. And we'll talk about how the labels change and things a little later. But for now, let me just kind of throw that in there to give you some preemptive confusion. It's not ultimately, at this point, going to be important, but it will be in a later chapter. But needless to say, the people that carried this label at that time of Republicans, they opposed ratification. They wanted to protect state sovereignty, states' rights, and in some cases they didn't want any national union at all. They wanted 13 separate states to a large degree. I mean, truly, there were some people that felt that way. They did say that maybe things, and I'm kind of glossing some things over since we don't have the time to go into the individual personalities and statements, but there was some sentiment that if there were additional protections in terms of, say, a Bill of Rights included in the Constitution, then perhaps they would be a little bit more sympathetic to it. But they were really just afraid that this new central government was going to just absolutely infringe upon people's liberties, very similar to the way that the British did, or even worse. And so maybe if there had been a Bill of Rights included, then maybe we'd be a little bit more accepting. But they were still not real thrilled about the states losing the bulk of their power. At least that's how they saw it. However, the Federalists ended up, or the pro-ratification forces at this point, maybe you can call them that just as accurately, ended up going kind of on this public relations push, and the Federalist Papers were a part of that. I'd mentioned they were a series of essays that were published mostly in New York newspapers, but they did find their way around to the rest of the country eventually. But Madison, Hamilton, and Jay tried to persuade the public. I mean, with sound arguments in those essays. And we have quoted Federalist number 10 and Federalist number 51, but there were a lot of other essays that they put out there to try to persuade people, particularly in New York, which is where Hamilton lived. And I believe John Jay did too, if I remember my history correctly. I won't test you on that, and my memory is a little fuzzy, but I believe he was a New Yorker as well. And New York was a big state even then, and they wanted to persuade people in New York to come along, and they knew that it was a questionable proposition in that state at the time. But the essays did make it around to the rest of the country. They did have a lot of provide a lot of insight into what not just Madison, Hamilton, and Jay thought, but many of the other pro-ratification figures of the day actually believed. They were trying to offset some of the fears that some of the anti-federalists had been putting out there and kind of stirring up amongst the people. There was a compromise that ultimately came around that did allow for it was probably essential to the ratification of the Constitution. Madison ended up making a promise to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, and or at least propose one. Of course, he couldn't do it by himself. We're going to talk about that process from Article 5 in a minute. But some of these Jeffersonian Republicans later, maybe we could refer to them as anti-federalists now, that opposed ratification. They agreed to go ahead and step out of the way and either support the new Constitution or at least remain quiet, so long as there was, a Bill of Rights added. So we end up with 10 amendments to the Constitution almost right off the bat. You did have some Federalists push back against the idea because they thought you could end up creating this. First, they thought they were unnecessary. But then they also thought that you might end up creating an ironic situation in that somebody someday would claim that people didn't have certain rights if they weren't included in the Bill of Rights. And Hamilton tried to kind of argue that you might be actually taking your cause of liberty a little bit backward. Not only are these things unnecessary, but you may end up confusing the situation and giving somebody the ability to argue that, hey, if a right isn't listed in that Bill of Rights, then it doesn't exist, and the government can take action, in that arena to restrict a behavior. They ended up addressing that through, some language in the Ninth Amendment, but we'll again get to that here in just a little bit. I'm going to skip this chart here because we've run through all of it already, and start talking about, and again, we're going to come back to the Bill of Rights later and how they all got through there in Article 5 soon. But here is a chart that shows you the ratification date and the votes for and against the Constitution and whether it would go into effect. You ended up having North Carolina, of all states, I think originally vote against it and then come back and swing around and say, hey, no, we're actually going to go ahead and be for it. Strangely enough, the Constitution itself, somewhat, and by some people's estimation, somewhat kind of almost, I guess, arrogantly, put a requirement in there that in Article 7 that said as long as 9 states vote to ratify this Constitution, it will go into effect. The problem with that is that the articles that were already in operation said that you had to have a unanimous vote of the states in order to be able to really amend the articles, probably much less throw them out completely. And so there was this argument going on about whether 9 states were sufficient to actually put the Constitution into effect. Ultimately, there was unanimity among the states. There was some arm twisting with Rhode Island. It took all the way into the summer of, or I guess late spring of 1790, to get them to actually ratify on a very close vote. Again, that's a historical thing we don't have time to get into, but there was a little bit of kind of implicit, kind of ominous threatening and some arm twisting that went on. Delaware was the very first state to ratify the Constitution. You will see on their license plates, they're the Constitution state and things like that. They're proud of that. They did it all the way back in 1787. But it was, I believe, I think it was North Carolina was, well, maybe I'm wrong about that because these might be in order. Yeah, I think they are. But it was the 9th state, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I guess it was New Hampshire that must have put it into effect, if I got that right. That doesn't seem right from memory, but anyway, it was 9 states that it took to put the Constitution into effect, and they ultimately got them. They wanted unanimity, and even more importantly, in the early stages, to try to achieve that unanimity, they needed the big states like Virginia and like New York to come along. They really needed the bigger states to buy into this. So these 2 victories here in 1788 were actually still pretty important, despite when they happened. Let's move along here and get into this process of amending the Constitution. This chart is about as simple as it gets, and yet still requires some explanation. There are 2 different ways that you can propose an amendment to the Constitution, and remember that takes place under Article 5. We're going to need to propose some really early on in order to keep that promise to the Anti-Federalists that came along on ratification after a Bill of Rights was promised, and the only way to add it was through this amendment process. But so we got to follow through Article 5 and talk about the 2 ways in which amendments can be proposed. Congress, through a supermajority vote, essentially of 2/3 of both chambers, can propose an amendment. Or you can have a national convention that requires, or called by Congress, the request of 3/4 of the state legislatures. So really 3/4 of the states have to call for a constitutional convention, or you have to have 2/3 of both chambers of Congress to propose said amendment. And then it goes over, and you can do either one of these other 2 things in order to get it ratified. And you think, well, it doesn't seem too difficult. It's just that you've got 2 options to ratify and 2 options to propose, and it can create a lot of these crisscrossing arrows and everything else. But let's follow the by far the most common, almost only way in which a constitutional amendment has ever taken place or been ratified, proposed and ratified. Usually you have Congress propose an amendment by a 2/3 vote, and then it'll go over here to the ratification side of this chart and be sent out to the states, and you have to have 3/4 of the states legislatures to approve it. That doesn't mean by a 3/4 vote. It means by a majority vote in each legislature. I guess except for Nebraska, like I mentioned earlier, you're going to have something like a House and a Senate, slightly different names here and there, but both chambers can vote in a majority, simple majority, 50+1, in order to provide their vote of approval. And if you can get 3/4 of the states to do that, and today that's 38 states, then you've got a new amendment to the Constitution. There's another option that was only used once, and you can have these ratifying conventions in 3/4 of the states approve of the proposed amendment. Doesn't matter how it was proposed. Either one of these methods work, but we've only used this one time. with these ratifying conventions once, and it was to put an end to prohibition. And we don't have time to discuss the politics of that and the circumstances under which it was seen as necessary to do that. But we might not have been able to repeal prohibition without using this method that one time. So two methods to propose. It doesn't matter whether it was Congress by a 2/3 vote or 3/4 of the state legislatures calling for this convention. You can then ratify an amendment by having 3/4 of the state legislatures approve of it, or by having the special ratifying conventions in 3/4 of the states approve of it. This one's only been used once, though. So it sounds kind of simple, despite the fact that you've got all these multiple options. Especially, it's simple if you just consider that we've only done this one path for 26 of the 27 amendments, and it was only the repeal of prohibition that used that method of ratifying conventions. However, there are 27 amendments to the Constitution, but 11,000 have been considered by Congress. Only 33, though, have been submitted to the states after they had been approved by Congress. It's difficult to get a 2/3 majority in Congress for anything, to override a veto, to approve a treaty, anything. To something with the gravity of amending the Constitution, you probably have larger political and logistical and psychological barriers to it. But once you get over that hurdle, and you send out these 33 amendments to be considered by the states, you still have to get 3/4 of them to approve it, and only 27 have been ratified since 1789. And that sounds like a pretty high success rate once you get out of Congress. However, you have to keep in mind that 10 of those happened at one time. Those are the Bill of Rights. And again, we're going to get into that in a moment, but that was the promised set of amendments to the anti-federalist forces to try to get them to kind of back off and have the Constitution go ahead and go into effect, or to support its ratification, as a matter of fact, in some cases. But so now you're down to 17, essentially, that have been ratified since the early 1790s. And one of those, there's a strange story. One of those 27 was actually proposed with the original Bill of Rights, and it was intended to keep Congress from voting themselves a raise until after another set of elections had taken place. It didn't end up being ratified by the states, and it was a student, I think at a university in Texas, I don't remember which one, who ended up having a disagreement with his professor about whether or not he had done quality work on researching that amendment that hadn't been ratified. He took a little bit of, umbrage or offense at his professor saying that, that topic wasn't really worth, his time or effort, or he didn't do a good job looking into it anyway, or something, and eventually ended up kind of starting this movement that got a 200 and I want to say I think it was 203-year-old amendment that had been proposed in 1790. I think it was to be passed in the early 1990s. So there was a holdover essentially from the original 12 amendments that were a part of or being proposed as part of the Bill of Rights that became 10 amendments. And the 11th one ended up being approved 203 years later to give us the 27th Amendment, preventing Congress from voting themselves raises until a new set of elections have taken place. All right, let's talk about I tell you what, very quickly, let's also talk about that situation just a little more, or at least something related to it. There is another amendment out there called the Equal Rights Amendment, and this might be a conversation more suited to the Civil Rights chapter. However, just so I don't forget and so that it's a little bit more timely, very recently the state of Virginia approved something known as the Equal Rights Amendment. It was proposed in the late 70s and ended up Congress, to avoid the situation that occurred with the 27th Amendment with the raises and everything taking 203 years to ratify, they put kind of a timer on it, a deadline, and they extended it once, but nonetheless you only had something like 7 years, I think, altogether to try to get the states to ratify the ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment. And it would have essentially provided for equality of treatment under the law regardless of a person's, the amendment uses the word sex, but we're talking about gender maybe in more contemporary terms. but the amendment uses the word sex. So it's talking about gender discrimination essentially. And Virginia ratified it recently, and there's going to be a question as to whether or not the timer or the deadline that Congress put on it mattered, and there are some states that voted to rescind their ratification of the ERA since that deadline has passed, and there's going to be some court battles over it. But advocates say that the proper number of states have ratified it to have it become part of the Constitution. Others say that some states have rescinded their ratifications and argue that the deadline is already passed. It's going to be an interesting thing, and it's related directly to this amendment process. And maybe by chapter, I guess it's 5, we'll be able to have a little bit more information and see where things are headed in regard to the potential 28th Amendment or the ERA. I've got some animations I didn't realize I had there. I do want to talk about very quickly too, and the ERA would fit in under this, that constitutional amendments have typically provided expansion of rights. You've got the 19th Amendment allowing for women the right to vote. That was ratified in 1920. Of course, you've got the 13th Amendment that outlawed slavery. The Bill of Rights, of course, by almost definition, as we'll talk about in Chapter 4, maybe in more detail, but we'll talk about it a little bit in a minute. They're all talking about the protection of or expansion of rights as being when you're a citizen of the United States. And so these amendments are typically seen as, I guess, good things. You had prohibition as the counterexample to that, but we ended up rolling that back with the 21st Amendment a little later. So the overarching, I guess the slide calls it the strongest theme amongst the amendments, is an expansion of liberty and rights and freedom of action and protections against government infringement on those freedoms. Here's a list of the constitutional amendments, and again you can see, okay, I was right. It was 203 years it took for ratification to take place, which means I guess it was proposed. I didn't do the math quite right, but it was done ratified in 1992, but it was I guess proposed in 1789, not 1790. But you can see all of these things do have that theme of essentially protecting or expanding rights. There are a couple of functional ones too that are a little bit more neutral. Where did they go? Where am I at? Are they listed? Yeah. You got some functional changes in the Electoral College and things with the 12th Amendment. But most of these rights are all going to end up being expansions of or protections for your civil liberties. I'm trying to think if there's any in here that I need to point out in particular. We're going to go into them in great detail, at least chapters 1 through 10. I'm sorry, amendments 1 through 10 in chapter 4, and then chapter 5. Just as a sneak preview here, you're going to have the prohibition of slavery, and then of course the 14th Amendment is going to become our good friend as we talk about not just civil rights but a lot of other things, civil liberties too. And then the 15th Amendment, of course, you can just read that and see where that would be a civil rights related amendment. But anyway, we'll work our way all the way down through most of these. We probably won't talk a lot about the 12th Amendment just because it's so kind of almost benignly functional in nature. Of course, it does involve the Electoral College, which is somewhat controversial. But anyway, you've got the 19th Amendment as that one. The 18th Amendment as that one exception to the expansion of rights that we undid with this repeal here on the 21st. But note all these on the Bill of Rights, happened very quickly after the Constitution was put into place. The Constitution was written in 1787. Essentially ratified in 1789, and then it wasn't but just 2 years later before you had all 12 amendments put before Congress, passed to the states, 10 of them approved in 2 years, 2 months, and 20 days. And given how long some of these others took, especially as you go further down the list, for individual amendments, you can see that was actually moving pretty fast, especially considering the technology of the time. The amending the Constitution in the formal sense through the Fifth Amendment isn't the only way in which the Constitution changes. Now, some people really get upset when I use that terminology or when anyone does, but the Constitution and its passages and the interpretation of it has evolved, over the years, almost independently of the amendments. Sometimes, in relation to them or whatever, but interpretation by the judicial branch, for instance, especially the Supreme Court, can often bring about an evolution in how we view the Constitution and its what its text means and everything else, even if we don't change that text. Sometimes it is so gradual as to barely be noticed, and yet if you were to kind of pick a point in time in the early part of the 19th century, and then pick another point in time in the latter part of the 20th or early part of the 21st century, you can see that things like legislation, things that presidents have done, and judicial decisions have gradually changed how we view, think about, and conceive of the Constitution and what it means. And if you believe that that is happening, or I guess maybe more accurately, if you believe that it's appropriate that it has happened, then you believe maybe in this concept of a living Constitution. The Constitution itself is actually fairly short. And it is, I think, in some ways, actually kind of vague on purpose. It might not have always been deliberate or intentional, but sometimes when they were trying to find their way through, a compromise to trying to reach one, it might have been best, in a practical sense, to leave the language vague, and that left it open to some pretty broad interpretations. And when you start blending in things like custom and precedent and usage and everything else, that living Constitution has adapted to changing times. Keep in mind that when the Constitution was written, the United States was a country of about 5 million people, and it was mostly rural, mostly agrarian, shoved up against the Atlantic seaboard. We were considered, quite honestly, kind of a backwater country, small, not powerful at all. Now we're a superpower with 330 million people, the largest industrial economy the world has ever seen. We're mostly an urban society now, or largely urban. We span a continent, and we are now not just a world power, but a if not the superpower on the planet, given a lot of the economic and military, cultural advantages that we have over most of the rest of the world. And so to take a document like the Constitution, have it written in 1787, have it amended a few times, 10 times, a couple of years later, and really only have it changed 27 times overall, and still have it be the basis under which, the charter that we use to govern ourselves, is actually pretty impressive. It is the oldest functioning written constitution in the world. A lot of other countries have had constitutions come and go, but this one has proven durable and has stood the test of time. And a large part of it is because we allow it to be a living, breathing document for the most part. There, again, are plenty of people who would disagree with this concept and would argue that it should never have taken place, and actually point to a lot of things in modern society and modern politics and government that they don't like, and say it's because we have allowed the Constitution to be viewed as a living Constitution. But for the most part, it's been everything from practical to understood to accepted to advocated that the Constitution have that type of flexibility, that it's not quite so rigid that the only way for it to actually adapt to anything is to follow the formal amendment process under Article 5. So, just keep in mind that there are plenty of ways to interpret the Constitution, and that's caused it to change over the centuries now, and certainly over the decades, and I guess we can now say centuries. And some people don't agree with that particular approach or conception of the document, but it has allowed it to make it through a civil war, a couple of world wars, a Great Depression, some counterculture stuff in the 60s, a couple of times where we thought we might have to impeach a president. It's made it through a lot, and some of that is due to the flexibility that was probably both deliberate and accidental in terms of its brevity, how vague it was, the powers we've given to the judicial branch, and some other things. Just as a historical side note, I think you'll probably have either already heard or you'll eventually hear about people like Thomas Jefferson thinking that the time frame varies depending on the quote and who's giving it and that kind of thing. But people like Thomas Jefferson would say something like every 20, they didn't expect the Constitution to last more than 20 to 25 years. They believed that you needed to reevaluate how you governed yourself every couple of decades. And they also thought, in some instances, that the Constitution was a weak form of government. We appropriately revere it today. It's proven. It's the wisdom of its authors, and again, it's proven durable and flexible, rigid when needed, and it's been put to a lot of tests and survived. But at the time, it wasn't quite as universally accepted and as renowned and revered as maybe we imagine. Looking back, because of the way we look at it today. These are questions that I normally kind of pose to my face-to-face classes, but we don't really have that opportunity here. You can take a look at them, and I've kind of answered some of them in a rapid fashion, trying to keep this short. I promised myself that I would limit it to 90 minutes, and I feel like I've done that. And in fact, looking at the timer, I've got about 5 minutes to go. Maybe I could have slowed down just a little bit, but I wanted to make sure that we got through the historical context of the Constitution, but certainly spent a little more time on the actual structure of it. I can go back to I need to go back here to this slide and just go ahead and give you a heads up that, of course, we're going to go into great detail about each branch of the government in Article 1, Article 2, and Article 3. Those will be each get a chapter later. So you may want to put particular emphasis on those three articles, since they outline a branch of the government, one branch of the three of the government that Madison and his model and the checks and balances kind of put in place. Those are the three branches where that really rests as much as anything. You do have some other checks and balances kind of contained here in Article 5, because, as we'll talk about later, one of the checks is the judiciary branch can make a decision, but if Congress can get the rest of the country to kind of go along with an amendment to override that judicial interpretation, then that's the ultimate check, I guess, on any branch of government practically, is that formal amendment process to the Constitution. Coming up next, though, we're going to talk about federalism, and that's going to involve some things like this supreme law of the land, and it's going to involve some of the, I think, the 10th Amendment, to the 9th and 10th Amendment to the Constitution, and some other things that we'll get into in that next chapter. Just as, again, a sneak preview, federalism is kind of this almost another balance of power. It's not between the branches of government, but it's actually between the levels of government, federal versus state. And I don't want to necessarily portray it as a competition, but there are some aspects of, I guess, a competitive analogy that are useful. But we'll get into that in the next chapter, and I hope to be able to cover that in less than an hour and a half as well. So please, there'll be an assignment, a forum created to let you ask for some clarification on things. If, again, whether it was because I was trying to move quickly, that I didn't cover something well, or maybe even the recording didn't get a hold of exactly what I was saying. It was garbled for some reason. That's a perfectly good thing to include in that forum assignment about this lecture, asking for expansion on a point, clarification of a point, or perhaps even, I hope it doesn't happen too often, clarification of maybe problem with the recording. Okay, that's chapter 2 over the Constitution, and I hope between this and your reading you've gotten all the information that you need.